Hello, this is the Fiction NonFiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And this is our Halloween episode. Real world news-wise, we are in a total horror show, such a horror show that the CDC has said that trick-or-treating is high risk.
There go my awesome costume plans.
You can't do anything anymore.
I can't do anything. What's low risk? I mean, definitely not watching like any sort of presidential campaigning, debate, discussion. It's like maybe it's technically a COVID-safe pursuit to sit on your couch, but I almost imploded screaming with horror watching the first debate. Yeah. And it seems kind of appropriate that our most horrific holiday is almost the last stop before the election.
Look, all of 2020 and all of this campaign has been to me a horror show. I keep waiting for the jump scare when somehow Biden's polling lead evaporates. I'm hoping that that's not going to happen.
I have to go find wood in my office and knock on it.
First damn thing every morning I'm checking, right? All right. So the thing is, we are doing an episode. Oh, are you gonna stay home and watch a movie? Is that what you're gonna do?
I mean, I guess I could try. I've been, as listeners to this show know, I'm a faithful watcher of Lovecraft Country, the last episode of which is coming up. But generally, I'm too chicken shit to watch horror movies and just have to kind of leave the room.
I can only really we watched Poltergeist the other night, and that was fun. I can do Poltergeist. The special effects were not scary. It was all, I was down with Poltergeist. That's about as far as I can go. Anyway. We're glued to the news of our horrific times, and so we're going to talk to some people who know about horror and frightening people. We've talked a little bit on the show about what it's like to write humor in the Trump era, but I've been wondering what it's been like to write and publish horror as our headlines grow steadily and steadily more alarming. Today, we'll have a chance to talk to two authors who deal in scares and fear and uneasiness about what it's like to write and publish in this interminable season of election horror. Later in the show, we'll speak with Laura Vandenberg about her new story collection, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears.
But first, we're thrilled to welcome Emily M. Danforth to the show. Emily's debut young adult novel, The Miseducation of Cameron Post, came out in 2012 and was named to numerous best book lists, translated into a half dozen languages, and adapted into a Sundance Award-winning feature film of the same name. Emily's second novel, Plain Bad Heroines, launched on Tuesday, 2 days before this episode's air date. Congratulations, Emily. Emily has an MFA in fiction from the University of Montana and a PhD in English and creative writing from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So it's a special treat for us to have you with us in your pub week and in the lead up to the election, which has been its own special kind of horror show.
Oh. Hurry up, damn it.
Yeah, like is this thing over yet? Your book caught my attention because it's a queer gothic horror comedy with meta elements. I'm kind of chicken and I'm not really good with like classic horror. And it's a book about a book and about the filming of a movie told in two timelines with illustrations. And it's also told in a very funny voice, which is how I wish 2020 had been told. And with all of those elements, the opening of the book establishes it as a horror story for and about queer women. It's suspenseful and a couple of characters die in intriguing ways in the beginning. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about the relationship between the real peril, the rights of LGBTQ and other folks have been in lately, and then this genre of horror.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that setup. I mean, I think one thing that as a queer person that I'm always thinking about is the ways in which folks that are trying to challenge our rights or remove them other us. And it's so much the language of monsters, right? It's unnatural, it's sinful, it's perverse, depraved. And I think it's something queer people are, really used to, is being completely dehumanized and then held up as a thing to fear. It's, wielded as this weapon of fear when folks are seeking to take our rights away. And so that's on my mind as a queer person. Certainly it's on my mind right now, but I guess as it applies to horror, there's like a real specific linkage between the Gothic novel, which is a form I'm really interested in, and the queer monster, so we can go back to Carmilla and think about the lesbian vampire. And one of the ways that queer people, I think, have related to that literature is we've reclaimed it, right? So, I mean, it's the lesbian vampire isn't the sort of monstrous other anymore. The lesbian vampire is now like an icon. It's like the stuff of 45 memes on an Instagram page. I'm thinking about lurking, obsessed Mrs. Danvers in Rebecca, and sort of like how horrifying that portrait is of like a queer, depraved, obsessed woman. And yet she's now like cool ice queen, Mrs. Danvers, right? Like in like, again, an Instagram meme I saw just the other day. And so we have reclaimed a lot of those sort of negative portrayals, those othering portrayals. And that's something that I was certainly interested in when I was thinking about this book, like how do we reclaim that terrain? And that links to the comedy, I think, too, of the novel. Horror and comedy have always been two sides of a coin. And there's something I think that like queer people are really, at least queer people, maybe a little bit of my generation, we're so used to kind of like using comedy in our approach to the world. And it makes so much sense to me in terms of the way that both comedy and horror use tension to pair those things. So I was thinking about all of those things, I guess, in how I initially thought about the landscape of Plain Bad Heroines.
I mean, that mixture of comedy and horror to me is this year. I mean, as I watched the president do these insane things that that seem they're hilarious, right? That when he's getting COVID and running around saying like, well, I'm going to dress up as Superman. I'm going to pretend like I'm weak. And then I'm going to come out of the hospital and rip off my shirt. I mean, this is comedy. And yet we understand this person, especially for queer people, is a horrific figure, right? A very dangerous man. I remember when he reversed the transgender ban on military personnel, which was something that I had written about. Or he reinstated it, right? And so I wonder how, if that was an intentional, like, did you feel the way that your book was in its tone, like mimicking this weird comedy horror, mix that we've been living through?
I think you're giving me way too much credit. Although again, like as a queer person, I think that is just how I've experienced the world, like since age 10, maybe is right. Like the like kind of recognizing the excesses and the absurdity while often being in fear of it. But no, I mean, I was working on this book for so long. So the fact that it's coming out like right in this moment, like I don't, I can't take that credit that like it maybe matched the tone of the year.
Oh, well, we tried to give it to you. We'll
thank you.
Have it later if you want it back.
Paul Tremblay had a horror novel come out this year and it's about a pandemic, right? And so he was getting a lot of crystal ball credit too. And I think, yeah, it just doesn't work that way, but I appreciate it.
So your book has its roots in another book from 1902, the story of Mary Mclean. That's a famous queer memoir, which at the time it came out was regarded as dangerous by many people. Can you tell us a little bit about how that book led to yours? Speaking of actual origins rather than the Trump administration origin that I was trying to pretend happened.
The credit you gave me. Mary Mclean's book is, well, I think one of the things that's been really sort of fun and surprising to me is that some early readers, because the book is meta, have in one case, like actually accused me of making her up. And I want to make very clear on this podcast, I did not invent Mary Mclean. I didn't invent her Wikipedia page. I don't have those resources. Like she's very real. And if you haven't read her memoir that, yes, she wrote at the age of 19, which she wanted titled, I Await the Devil's Coming, which is about the best title for a memoir of all time. You can find it. It's been reissued and it's so vibrant and funny. And smart and just so queer. The voice is so queer. And so, yeah, I was, and she's also a Montanan and I'm a Montanan, and I learned about her, kind of in my late 20s and was surprised that I hadn't, as someone who has sort of obsessively sought out sapphic narratives from the past, I was surprised that I hadn't heard of her before. And then what I heard about her, and this is something the book really takes up, is what a sensation she was, right? That her book sold 80,000 copies in its first month, and that she had a drink named after her and a cigar named after her. And the book did the exact thing she wanted it to do, was sort of lift her up out of barren Butte, Montana, and set her on a world, world stage. She really wanted fame. So I heard all of this sort of, that she was called a mad woman and all these other things I heard about Mary Mclean. What I didn't expect is just how great the book would be when I finally picked it up, and how much I would enjoy her voice and her candor. So I feel like more than anything else, the presence of Mary Mclean haunts this novel in every way. I think like her perspective and her refusal to be boxed in and her many contradictions. She's not really a character in the novel. Her book is, but she saturates every page of it. So, and I'm thrilled that, like, if this book does nothing else, that it will introduce some readers to Mary Mclean who don't know her.
Could you, while we're here at the beginning, could read to us some opening scenes from Plain Bad Heroines?
Yes, thank you. I think all you need to know for the setup of this is that we're at the Brookhant School for Girls. It's 1902, the fall of 1902, and two young women who are in love and obsessed with Mary Mclean's book have just met their very unfortunate end due to a sort of swarm of yellow jackets. And I'm sure that seems like a lot, but that is the setup to this section. That a copy, a much loved and underlined and page-marked copy, was found near the bodies is undisputed. The story of Mary Mclean, the scandalous debut memoir of its namesake 19-year-old, had a deep crimson binding when the dust jacket was removed. A red book was not hard to spot when left almost indecently splayed against a cluster of ferns so enormous they looked like half-opened green parasols. Even in such a gruesome scene, the book stood out. Much was later made of the underlined section it was found opened to. I have lived my 19 years buried in an environment at utter variance with my natural instincts, where my inner life is never touched and my sympathies rarely, if ever, appealed to. I never disclosed my real desires or the texture of my soul, never, that is to say, to anyone except my one friend, the anemone lady. And so every day of my life I am playing a part. I am keeping an immense bundle of things hidden under my cloak. It was no secret on campus how enthralled with that book both Flo and Clara were, and more broadly with Mary Mclean herself. As you likely already know, they'd formed the Plain Bad Heroines Society as a way to show their devotion. But who brought the book into the trees that day isn't as certain as the fact that a copy was with them in their final moments. Some of the onlookers said Clara was carrying nothing at all on her march from the motor car, while others swore that they saw the book gripped in her hand as she crossed the lawn. Though she'd been seen with it so frequently that school year, it's natural to wonder if they might have imagined that part. It was, after all, the book, the one that brought her and Flo together, the one that said, printed there on the page, the things Clara had once believed were her private thoughts alone. It was the book that Clara so often thought that truly, she could have written herself. She could have had it sewn to her palm and still been unencumbered by it. And if you asked Clara's mother, she would have told you that Clara might as well have had that vile book sewn to her hand for the length of their summer in Newport, because it had been there day in and day out. Later, when Clara's traveling case was searched, for it had been left there on the ground next to the car where Charles had dumped it, no copy of the story of Mary Mclean was found. This would seem to suggest that Clara Broward did take her book with her into the woods that day. It would seem to suggest that, except for this. In a letter sent after her daughter's unfortunate death, Mrs. Broward told her sister, in great detail, of the cold comfort she had taken in burning Clara's copy of that hateful book in the flames of her bedroom fireplace. She wrote that she began at page 1, tore it free, fed the fire, and continued on until the red binding flapped empty, like a mouth with no teeth. And then she burned the empty mouth. Mrs. Broward certainly believed that she did this to the only copy of Mary Mclean's memoir that she knew her daughter to have ever owned. Of course, all of this was only spoken of later. Perhaps you already know that when the story of Flo and Clara's deaths reached the press, Mary Mclean herself, then staying nearby at a seaside hotel in Massachusetts, was asked to issue a statement. She's reported to have said, "I wish I could have known those girls." This was both uncharacteristically short for a Mary Mclean statement to the press in those days, and the thing that the two of them no doubt would have wanted to hear the most from her. Before we move on, one more thing about that copy of the book found with the bodies. It was handled by faculty and police, Pinkertons, and even Flo's and Clara's bereaved family members, not one of who claimed it as belonging to their kin. And then, not so long after, it was misplaced. Officially misplaced anyway, lost, unable to be located when it was asked after by reporters who felt sure they'd missed something the first time they'd gone through it, and who now wanted another look. Even Principal Libby Brookhants herself could not find it. She was the school's young if capable founder. She knew its grounds and buildings better than anyone else left alive, and she told those doubting reporters that she had made a point of looking for the copy in question in every place on campus that it might have conceivably ended up. It simply could not be found. The book was gone.
Thank you so much. I love that opening. I was on the edge of my seat with those yellow jackets and that trek into the woods. And I looked up the story of Mary Mclean and was struck by the confident voice of the opening lines. And you can actually find, it's available in Project Gutenberg, and you can see old covers. And as you mentioned, it's been reissued. And Mary Mclean, she calls herself charmingly original, and the sentence "I am a genius" is one of the early sentences in the book. I'm gonna take a leaf from this in my next work. And like, she's 19 years old. She's like, "I'm a genius. I'm awesome."
Well, my son says that all the time. 15.
I mean, a woman in 1902, I think, is a different thing.
Yes.
But, I mean, it's amazing, the voice of that book. And I took a bunch of I of womankind and of 19 years will now begin to set down as full and frank a portrayal as I am able of myself. And she describes herself just really unabashedly as odd. I just really appreciated I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing. I read that some family documents of yours that contained queer personal histories were burned. And that description that you just read with the sort of image of the mouth, the book is a mouth. And in the passage you read, right, that's Clara Broward's mother burning a copy of Mclean's book that belonged to her daughter. How did the strong voice of Mary Mclean and people's reactions to it lead to the fictional characters you created, your Plain Bad Heroines, especially the ones in the modern storyline?
The book is so fun. So yeah, I think you'll enjoy reading it so much. Story of Mary Mclean, I mean, not my own book. One thing about the characters in the past, I guess, like I should say that this forming of a Mary Mclean society, which is what Flo and Clara have done, and some other students on campus, that was something that happened in the U.S. on the release of Mary Mclean's book. There were sort of young women all over the country that formed clubs in her honor, and so that was one way, just one of the many ways that the book informs the past. I think in terms of the voice of the present characters, she's particularly reflected in Merritt, who is the writer who wrote the history of the curse of the Brooke School for Girls, and who is very self-aware and who I think would be a little too self-aware in sort of a contemporary sense to maybe call herself a genius, but I think thinks, right, that she's sometimes the smartest person in the room, although has a lot of sort of like really deep anxiety too. And I think one of the things that's so interesting again, and so feels so fresh about Mary Mclean's book, is that really perceptive self-analysis she turns, right, like on her throughout the book. There's this like the real awareness of the things she's creating, what she's trying to say, and her many contradictions. And she'll call herself a genius, and by the next page be talking about the barren emptiness of her life. And it feels like a blog that you could read now, right? Like, I mean, it really does. And so I think some of her voice echoes up in Merritt and how she describes herself or thinks of herself or thinks of what she's trying to do, and most particularly. But I mean, again, Mary Mclean is all over this book. Like, she really saturates it and all the characters.
I do love that. And that movement, when you're talking about Mary Mclean, and is that movement between being super overconfident and then having this hidden part of your life that she writes about so well. It's kind of quite remarkable. And I was only being facetious. I mean, my 15-year-old boy faces none of the challenges that Mary Mclean was facing in her time period, right?
Sure.
Just that there is for all of us, I think, can recognize and understand that sense of needing to be confident and then having things that we also are not confident about, And so I found that relatable in any case. But how many books, I'm trying to think of books that have like an Easter egged book in it that's also like reading your book and having you go on tours, also about, talking about this other book that they're sort of connected to. And are there other examples of this? Do you know of any? Is this I find it really fascinating and wonderful, particularly for a podcast that is interested in literary history.
I'm not sure that this sort of completely answers your question, but I think one thing I was thinking about in terms of Easter eggs or books within books is just the long tradition in Gothic fiction, in particular, of the cursed object that gets passed hand to hand. And that's in particular one of the ways that Mary Mclean's book gets used, right? So its content is talked about, its effect, but this idea, something I was really thinking about was this idea of it as a bad book. What do we mean when we call something a bad book? And that takes on many different forms within the novel. So there's this idea that there is a literal curse perhaps attached to this book, that it is somehow a malevolent object. But also, of course, people are throughout the novel decrying its sort of content in terms of morality, right, and customs. So I was thinking about books within a book that way, and there are plenty of Gothic novels that have used books as sort of cursed objects.
The movie that I was probably most scared of watching in my life, other than Jordan Peele, was The Ring, which has a cursed object in it.
Absolutely.
Which is a film. And then, I remember a friend coming back to my apartment, finding me crouched on the couch with my fingers over my face, unable to take the tape out of the VCR.
You watched it on a tape. Oh yeah. No. Bad idea. Yeah.
Don't do that. I think, as we read the news now, it's very obvious that there's like another set of fantasies operating for a different set of people. Now, as I was reading, I was thinking about these places I had been and lived, and I was also kind of watching out of the corner of my eye another horror movie I can just barely stand to see, the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings. And, I was seeing like a lot of my friends, one of those moments of, is this actually what's happening? People texting each other. They're talking about her children and how her being a mother has qualified her to be a leader. Have you ever seen this discussed in this way? For a male candidate for the Supreme Court, this Republican senator is celebrating her motherhood, her very appropriate performance of like straight Christian womanhood. And so she is a major worry of mine, that I'm having. We're taping this on the Friday before the episode comes out, and I guess we'll know a variety of things. Are the plot of our lives moving at the pace of a Scandal episode? So she's my big worry. What are your big fears these days, and what's your big hopes for us going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've also only been able to tune into that confirmation hearing as the horror show. Like, I've been watching it in the same way, like through my hands, basically, and in bites. I mean, I think it's impossible to be alive right now and not be fearful of the pandemic and all of the ways it's acting upon the world, right? So like the virus itself and like our uncertainty about that and all of the deaths, which, it just feels like it's a kind of a ticker box on the bottom of a screen sometimes, but also the significant sort of increase in poverty and folks needing to go to food lines and I mean just all the kind of uncertainty I see in my nieces and nephews who are not in college this year and around me. So I'm thinking a lot about that, like what does this look like? And I think again when we talk about horror, it's that uncertainty, right? Like in this sense of kind of like just continued doom and dread. So yeah, I mean, I would have to answer, I think, the pandemic. It's a huge fear, and what our response hasn't looked like, and when we're going to be able to kind of look at it in the rear view.
If we want people to be watching something, it should be, or paying attention to something, they should be paying attention to your book, Plain Bad Heroines. And we're going to suggest and remind our readers to go out and pick that up. And we're going to congratulate you on your on the book's debut coming out right now. And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.